Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome to another episode of Aspire. And I have to tell our audience I am quite excited about our discussion today. And it is not something that I ever thought would be possible, but many thanks to my co-host, Hugh Eastman, through relationships and connections here, we were able to secure Sherrie Westin, CEO of Sesame Workshop, who will be joining us today. Sherrie is responsible for something that was a major part of my life growing up, and something that was a part of giving me positive role models from the time I was a toddler. And I am so grateful for having had the example of Sesame Street when I was young and not really fully appreciating it until I got into this work in terms of aspirational masculinity. But I want to introduce our guest today, Sherrie Westin, who is the CEO of Sesame Workshop, which is responsible for Sesame Street. And Sherrie has a remarkable career through media, through nonprofits, through government service. And I can't think of anyone better to have on the show and have an open discussion about the state of masculinity, the importance of social emotional learning, and the role that Sesame Street has played, continues to play, and will play in the future for shaping generations of young people. So Sherrie, welcome to the I Have the Right To Aspirational Masculinity podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. And you're right, Hugh's very well connected, like even with Muppets. So I think he booked this through Grover. I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember.
I'm jealous. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your time today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Hugh to kick us off, and we are looking forward to this conversation.
Great.
Hi, Sherrie. First of all, thank you so much for coming in and doing this. We're really excited to have you. And, it's kind of a different approach that we've taken, because with Sesame Street being such a younger audience, but also such a universal, show that all of us have grown up with, I think it will be interesting to dive into, how certain characters are structured or how they promote any form of masculinity or emotional well-being and in general. So I guess my first question for you is, growing up, I was a big Cookie Monster fan. And before this, I was thinking a lot about the characters like Elmo, Big Bird, Cookie Monster. And I was wondering, why or how are they all structured in a certain way? Like, they all have their own characteristics. Like Cookie Monster is, more of a meaner guy. Not necessarily meaner, but, he's...
Only if you get between him and a cookie. Otherwise.
So what is the process for thinking about different characters and targeting, different characters under different lights, or how are you structuring these characters and how are you promoting them in certain ways?
Yeah. Well, again, Hugh, thank you so much for having me. I think this will be a fun conversation. But listen, I love talking about this because I think there's so much to Sesame Street that people don't understand that goes into it. But if I start back, I'll start first by explaining the mission of Sesame Street is to help all children grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. And that sounds like a clever tagline, but it's actually baked into the curriculum in every way. So smarter is the academic basics. You think of ABCs and 1, 2, 3s on Sesame, right? Stronger is about resilience and coping with challenges and health. And kinder, of course, is empathy, understanding, respect for differences. So understanding the mission. Now let me take you a little bit through the history, because Sesame was created in the late 60s. It was during the Civil Rights Movement, the War on Poverty. And there was a lot of research that showed that children in poverty, particularly children of color, were falling behind because they didn't have the skills they needed when they arrived at school to be ready to learn. So Sesame Street was a huge experiment. And there was a producer named Joan Gans Cooney who had this idea, did all of this research to see if television could be used to teach. Especially, could it reach children who didn't have the same quality preschool or access to early education to help all children arrive at school ready to learn? So it starts as an experiment, right? At the time, there really was no educational television, but television was the new medium, right? Everybody had television. And so with the idea of figuring out I think the idea was they knew that young kids were learning beer commercials and jingles from watching television. Could they market the letters and numbers and instead of like commercials, right? So it started with a group of Harvard educators, the creatives, the producers, and I think it was incredibly prescient because if you think about the mission, how can we engage children, teach children, and how can we model characters for children really to feel hopeful and joyful and enjoy learning? It has to be engaging as well as educational. Hiring Jim Henson and bringing the Muppets, I think, was brilliant, right? So when you were creating characters, they weren't just to entertain. Each one had, they were helping to deliver on the curriculum. So Bert and Ernie were meant to show that opposites could be best friends. So it's about accepting differences. And the Grouch was meant to show that you could have a very different worldview and still be friends. Like a very different, Grouch is the only one who's constantly contrarian, right? Big Bird is 6 years old. Big Bird is really the friend, the kind, like if you think about their characters, Elmo was not introduced until several years later, but Elmo is the one character that is 3.5. He was the youngest. And I'm convinced one of the reasons that young children fall in love with Elmo first, if you have any friends with younger kids, the 2-year-olds, Elmo's like a rock star. And I think a lot of that is because Elmo's 3.5. And so they identify with him. And so much research and goes into how a character would portray their characteristics, how they would stay true to their age. It gives us the opportunity in storylines. Cookie Monster's very impulsive, but during the obesity crisis, Cookie Monster really started teaching you that cookies were a sometimes food and fruit and veggies were an anytime food, right? He's never going to stop eating cookies. That wouldn't be true to his character. But we use those characters to deliver on storylines and curriculum. And one other thing I'd love to share is that, most people don't realize, they think of Sesame Street as the show here in the US, right? They don't realize we're in 150 countries. And in many of those countries, we create completely local adaptations. And so I'll give you a few examples. In India, where girls were often left behind or didn't have the opportunity to go to school, one of the lead Muppets is named Chomsky. She wears her school uniform. She's really feisty. Her best friend is Elmo. So you've created a local Indian Muppet. You still have other characters like Elmo, but the storylines allow us to show that Elmo and Chomsky are equals. They do problem solving together. So you're breaking down that gender stereotype that a girl wouldn't be able to do that. In Afghanistan, where we were on the air for 10 years with Bache Simpson, which is it was Sesame Garden. Again, where girls are often not allowed to go to school, the lead Muppet was a little girl named Zari. Again, she wore her hijab, her school uniform, and her younger brother Xerox was specifically created so that he would look up to Zari. He would help with chores. They would interview, you know how Muppet bits are often with a real person? They would interview real Afghan doctors or lawyers. And we do so much research on our work. The research showed that boys who watched Bache Simpson, and it was the number one program, even in Afghanistan, we were reaching like 87% of the country, believe it or not. Boys tested 29% higher on gender parity, saying that girls and boys could do the same things. They could, and that in a country like Afghanistan shows the power of media and Muppets. It's pretty incredible. Changing attitudes. And what's even better about that example is we also did research with parents, because in a country like Afghanistan, a majority of the audience are watching with an adult. I think it's 87%. So with fathers cited watching Bache Simpson again and again as the reason they decided to allow their daughter to go to school. That's huge, right? Because I think the appeal that Sesame has to adults as well as children is huge, but also it's non-threatening. It's a children's show. So you're influencing that father's attitude without waving your finger and saying you should send your daughter to school. But he's seeing this characters he's seeing the live action films. We would deliberately, when we would do live action films, we would show a father helping get his Afghan daughter ready for school. And so I guess what I'm saying is we do a lot to make sure these characters can be powerful role models, but also to sort of open hearts and minds in terms of attitudes and behaviors. And I think it's a really a powerful tool in helping to break down those gender stereotypes. And to your point, Hugh, to start, another big part is building like the emotional well-being, to help children better understand emotions, manage emotions, so that you do have, for both boys and girls, opportunities to build that foundation at a very young age.
And I think just going off of that, obviously regulating emotions is such a big part of a child's development. And as you just touched on, Sesame Street does that very well. But I think often media doesn't really portray handling emotions, especially at a young age, that well, especially with boys. I think that often creates that perception of being limited to a certain range of emotions. But I think Sesame Street actually kind of promotes this wholeness and inclusion of all of these different emotions. So I would ask you, how do you think that Sesame Workshop and Sesame Street is able to kind of approach this challenge of teaching children how to deal with these emotions while also keeping them fun and engaging, so they are willing to learn and want to learn about how to manage these emotions? And so they see it as kind of something that they want to look forward to, not as kind of a restraint to them.
Well, you're absolutely right. As I said at the outset, for us to teach, we have to still be engaging. And so Sesame's approach is always with humor, with joy, with hope. Even when we're tackling really difficult issues, we do so in a positive, hopeful way to give children the tools they need to build resilience, to cope with challenges. And, during COVID, obviously, we pivoted to do a lot of content that was really helping children cope with COVID, with everything from mask and even the Muppets were on Zooms, right? Like helping children sort of understand the new reality, as well as cope with really challenging issues and, when a parent is sick. But after COVID, we realized that there were already mental health challenges, but COVID really exacerbated that. The American Academy of Pediatrics even called mental health a crisis for young children. Most often people think of these as adult issues and don't realize they start at the very young ages. And so we started an emotional well-being program. And again, that means we created curriculum, we created materials, we put it into the curriculum of the show. And that always starts with research. So everything Sesame does, we research in the beginning, sort of formative. We bring in advisors and experts so that we're learning. We also have a lot of child development experts, who are part of our staff. We then start creating content and we test it with children to make sure we're having the outcomes we intended. At the same time, we're testing whether children are laughing and enjoying it and watching it, because again, we have to reach to teach. And if we're not engaging and entertaining, then we're not going to keep the child. We have to also compete with all these other children's shows that are completely focused on just entertaining without trying to build in a curriculum. We have a much higher bar. And so that's a big part of having this model where the researchers, the educators, and the really talented creatives are working together. And they're creating storylines and scripts that include humor, but also very specific outcomes, like, for instance, the emotional ABCs. Children can't learn to regulate their emotions if they can't identify them. So helping children have a language for angry or frustrated, because keep in mind, we're reaching children from like 2 to 5, right? And so it's helping identify emotions and then giving them tools. And there are all sorts of storylines where you'll see, Elmo is really frustrated with Abby, or there's a conflict, or there's jealousy, and then how they're working that out. And it's everything from very specific tools like Elmo teaches belly breathing. It's I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to breathe out. We have all these wonderful techniques to help children manage stress. And it's not just on the show. When we do this, we create resources for parents that are on sesameworkshop.org. We work with organizations that are working with families, and particularly with vulnerable families, to provide those resources. So it'll be books, it'll be videos, it'll be curriculum, it'll be materials for parents to help use those material with children. And then the fact that Sesame also appeals to adults gives us a huge opportunity with older audiences. I'll give you a great example. For our mental health work, Elmo tweeted, I don't know if anybody remembers this, it was about a year ago. Elmo tweeted, "How's everybody doing?" All right, this was just to reach out and check on people. Well, it became a viral sensation. Over 330 million people engaged with that viral tweet. I mean, can you imagine? And it helped destigmatize mental health issues, which Sesame is really, has a powerful opportunity to make it okay to talk about issues. We've done that with autism, with the first autistic Muppet, Julia. We've done that with HIV and AIDS in South Africa with an HIV positive Muppet, Cami. So making it okay, destigmatizing mental health. And then those who engaged with Elmo on that tweet, we then sent links to our resources to help families deal with mental health issues for young children. So again, that adult appeal allows us to take this to not only young children, but to the adults in their lives, to teens, to fans. And I have to say, I've been at Sesame a long time, but one of the things that I think is also incredibly brilliant is that Joan Gans Cooney, who created Sesame Street, even though she included Harvard educators, there wasn't a lot of research on sort of the brain science that we have today. And all of her hunches that if you reach children in the early years, we could have the greatest impact is now proven by the brain science of their brain develops more in the first 5 years than any other time. So that's when they're learning the most. It's when we can have the most influence. It's when they're forming their sense of self. Also, if a child, any child learns from engaging with a caring adult. That's how you really learn, right? In a child who is struggling with trauma or what's often called toxic stress or really challenging situations, I don't mean a one-time, but an ongoing, trauma or stress. The most important thing to help mitigate, it literally affects their brain development. It literally makes it harder for the synapses to form because they're constantly in the higher cortisol fight or flight mode, which affects their brain development. What's the most important thing to help a child to help mitigate that? It's more engagement with an adult. It's called nurturing care. Joan also had a hunch that if adults were watching with a child, this is all the way back in 1969, that the learning would be deeper, that it would carry on off screen. That's why there was humor, parodies, Muppets, celebrities, musicians, because she wanted adults to not, to find it fun to watch Sesame and to engage with Sesame. So if you fast forward with all that we know today, I think Sesame's adult appeal is what allows us to have the greatest impact. And I think it's what's, kept us a part of the zeitgeist for 55 years. You can't name a lot of shows that are here 55 years later. So again, that's a lot, but it speaks to when we're trying to help build emotional well-being and give children those tools and foundations early in life. It's really based on so much science and so much creativity to model these characteristics, give children tools, and help the adults in their life be able to understand those issues as well.
So, as one of the hundreds of millions of consumers of Sesame Street, it is fascinating to hear of the design and science behind it, which of course, you as an adult now, you just assume is in the design. But I loved hearing the backstory about it was a frontier time when Sesame Street debuted. And it did have that cool factor because you never knew who was going to appear on the show, which is one of the reasons as an adult, to make sure that you grabbed your coffee when it came on to sort of sit down and spend and share that time with your child. But
well, and today, again, I think one of the other reasons it helps us be contemporary and stay relevant is we're always responding to the needs of today, like a mental health crisis, obesity crisis, rising numbers of autism, and creating content. But also the fact that you're still having contemporary celebrities and musicians, and we're using social media, it really keeps us more, again, in the culturally relevant.
And so one question then I have for you, because as I look back through my sort of internal memory book and think about my experiences with Sesame Street as a child in the late 60s, it did seem to me, now looking back on it, is there are a lot of male characters and that were very diverse. And, I don't know if that was part of the thinking back then, but, we all live in a society that says there are certain roles that men play. And men are supposed to be the stoic, we're supposed to be the Marlboro man, right? Unemotional, stoic. If we show an emotion, it's anger or rage is allowable. But we're not allowed to show vulnerability. We're not allowed to show sensitivity. We're not allowed to cry, show emotions. And yet, all of the wonderful characters from Sesame Street, were so very different, but they all had this underlying ability to connect, with each other, and therefore with the audience. So was that something that was recognized as a need in terms of male role models, or no?
Well, absolutely. I think that it was also recognized as a need to just have a street where everyone was welcome, everyone was supportive of one another. This was the first multiracial cast. I know so many people that say, children of color that are now adults who said the first time I saw myself on a children's program was on Sesame Street. And it's so important for children to see themselves in a positive light, whether that's you're a male and you're seeing males in a very positive light, whether that's a Latino, an African-American, like the fact that we created Julia, the first autistic Muppet, as we realized the number of children who were diagnosed with autism was skyrocketing. It took us 3 years, enormous amount of research working with families with children with autism. And what I love about it started as an initiative called See Amazing in All Children. We created Julia in a storybook before she became, a Muppet on the show. And it was both to help children with autism see themselves and feel less alone. She was a girl very purposely because a lot of people think only boys have autism. So we're even in choosing how we would create the character of Julia, there's so much thought that goes into it. We worked with every organization. Autism is a very, they're very different extremes from those who are self-advocates to those who want a cure, and there's a lot of controversy. But what we could get everyone to agree on is we were just trying to help destigmatize autism and provide tools for families that had a child with autism to make everyday moments easier. So that everyone could agree on. But no two children with autism are the same. So even deciding what characteristics Julia would have and what she wouldn't. But what became equally important was to help other children who were neurotypical have a deeper understanding of why Julia's different, so that we could increase empathy and understanding. And so if you think about some of the storylines, when Big Bird introduces Julia to Abby, he explains that just because she doesn't look you in the eye doesn't mean she doesn't want to be your friend. And then he says she has autism. So it's okay to talk about, you're breaking down. And all of our research has been amazing that teachers tell us that their students with autism have more play dates, that they're more accepted in class. I have the most amazing letters from parents about using Julia to explain to their child that they have autism like Julia. And so again, that's not about male or female, but it's an example of helping to allow children to see themselves in a positive light, and to make sure that we're modeling the behaviors that you would want a child to, that they're true role models. I remember President Obama, when he had not yet become president, but he was about to, and he met Joan Gans Cooney, the creator of Sesame. And he said to her, she's so used to people saying, my children grew up on it, my grandchildren watch. And he said, my sister and I grew up on Sesame. And he said, I knew it was made for me. I'll never forget that. Because his sister was white, he was Black, he was seeing a multiracial cast, right? You're seeing males and females together. And if you think of the human characters on Sesame Street, also, whether that was Luis, whether that was Bob, today Alan, they are very caring male characters who work to help everyone. So I think it's not just the Muppets, but it's the human characters that we include. And Alex, you're old enough, you may remember Mr. Hooper, the very first Mr. Hooper. Hugh, you guys, it was Gabriel. Mr. Hooper was played by a character, and he died unexpectedly. I think most shows would have just recast Mr. Hooper. But instead, Sesame did a special show. They spent time doing research, how to do it right, and decided they were going to help teach children about death and grief. And there's a whole episode where Maria explains to Big Bird that Mr. Hooper isn't coming back. He died. Because Big Bird doesn't understand. He wants to know when he's coming back. And, that's such a great example of Sesame dealing with real life issues, but in an age appropriate way to help children understand. And, I think it's a powerful example that we've been doing ever since, tackling real issues, but in a very hopeful, positive way. And giving parents the tools to address those issues with children, like mental health.
Thank you for that, Sherrie, as well.
It's hard to get me to talk about these things,
I have a question that's somewhat similar to Alex as well, because I know you talked about the history of Sesame Street and how you've been able to target certain issues through Sesame Street and through the lens that, children, that would be easier to understand for children, like our obesity crisis, COVID, all of these current day or issues throughout history. I think you mentioned conflict in Afghanistan and that as well. But what do you see currently as the most pressing issue that Sesame is, working to combat or working to focus on, especially in relation to like gender struggle and masculinity as well?
Well, I would say some of the examples I've given you, particularly with international productions, is no matter where we are, certain countries, girls' education is a big priority because girls are left behind, right? But it's as important to be modeling positive male characters as well as girls who have opportunities, because part of the reason in those countries girls aren't allowed is because of the attitudes and traditions and culture of males that don't value. So instead of just focusing on girls, you're going to focus on positive examples and role models for those male Muppets or those male characters. In anything we do, we will always focus on gender parity and breaking down gender stereotypes, whether that's the US show or around the world. And then depending on a country's needs, there may be a particular focus. I would say that coming back to emotional well-being, so much of that is steeped in making sure that girls and boys have the understanding and the tools they need at a young age to manage their emotions and to have tools to deal with anger or frustration at a young age. And if children in their early years are taught that boys aren't supposed to express their emotions, that's not going to be healthy for those boys as they get older. We have an opportunity in those first 5 years of life to really help manage emotions, but giving tools that it's okay to talk about those emotions. It's okay to identify those emotions. And then what are your strategies to address that, right? And I would say as we go forward, these are all somewhat related because Sesame has what you call a whole child curriculum. If you look at what a child needs to thrive and to arrive at school ready to learn and to succeed in school and life, it is not only those academic basics, it's those social emotional skills to deal well with others, for boys to deal well with girls, for children to accept differences. And so our curriculum for this year and also for next year is all tied to emotional well-being and kindness. I mean, in a developmental child development vernacular, you'd say compassionate mindset, but it's helping children to accept differences, be more empathetic, to learn empathy at a young age in order to be kinder to one another. And I think that is all relevant to what you're talking about, right? It basically, and when you look at the world today, not just in the US, but around the world, goodness knows, helping children to be more understanding, kinder, to be more able to get along with others, and is certainly something I think we could all benefit from, adults as well as children.
And I think that it's just so helpful as you have all these characters that are adapting to all these different cultures and kind of outside exterior appearances. And I think that really builds that sense of community that Sesame Street really provides for so many children and even adults around the world. But I would say I know that kind of feeling safe and supported is very helpful for children who really want to learn, and that's helpful for them to actually be successful in their learning. So I would ask, how do you think Sesame Street is able to really maintain that psychological safety and support for their children who are, let's say, experiencing stress or trauma at the home, but still able to feel connected and supported to Sesame Street, even if it's not kind of some exterior appearance, but more kind of an interior emotion, like an interior emotion or feeling that they have been experiencing at home, but still feel connected?
Well, I would say that what we've done at Sesame is we've looked at what are the most pressing issues affecting children. And we do that not only through our own understanding of the world, but through our partners, because we partner with a lot of organizations on the ground, Head Start, various organizations that are working particularly with vulnerable children and families across the country. So we learn from them what they're dealing with and what their needs are. And I'll give you a great example. Several years ago, when the opioid crisis became a huge issue, affecting so many families in all socioeconomic levels because of this crisis, we found that a lot of the child service organizations were dealing with children who had parents who were addicted, and yet there was nothing to help children understand that. There were no tools for a parent to help a child through that. And so often with issues like that, parents think a child is too young and they need to not know about it. In fact, children are so aware of what's going on. And even if they can't label it, it's very detrimental to their own, to your point, Gabrielle, their sense of safety, their sense of security. And so, working with organizations like Hazelton that deals with addiction, we created a program for parental addiction. And it was to help, that's not going to be on the show, just out there for any child, because it might be alarming, but we create videos, materials, resources. One of our Muppets, Lily, her parent has to go away. And Elmo's dad is explaining to Elmo that Lily's mom has a disease. It's called addiction. So it's again helping children see that Elmo's friend is going through the same thing, helping give parents resources to explain that. Another one of my favorite programs that we started that we're still doing was, it's now like 12 years old, is at a time when the U.S. was at the height of military deployment. It was the Iraq War. We read a piece in the New York Times that said that 700,000 families had very young children who were dealing with deployment and multiple deployments. And we thought, wow, that's so interesting. Who would have thought of that? We ended up working with the Department of Defense, brought together advisors, and found out that it was a huge issue for 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds who were having their dads go away, their moms go away, sometimes both, with no resources. And we created a program called Talk, Listen, Connect, where Elmo's dad has to leave. We distributed 6 million DVDs through Military One Source, and we did research afterwards. And when a father sat down and watched a video where Elmo's dad is explaining to him why he has to go away for a long time, it became the catalyst for the father to talk that through with their 3-year-old, which normally they wouldn't do, right? So with all children, Gabriel, to be more secure, to feel more supported, it's almost always important that they're being communicated to, that someone is helping them understand these issues in an age-appropriate way. And so that program is still going on. It grew to helping children cope when a parent comes home injured or changed. Rosita's father came home in a wheelchair. It grew to helping children when a parent doesn't come home, again, dealing with grief and loss. And again, we wouldn't just put that on the show because it might be frightening if you're not in that situation, but creating videos, creating resources, creating materials is an incredible opportunity to help that child who does have a specific challenging issue cope with that issue, and to help give those adults in their life tools and the wherewithal to understand they should be engaging. It's more important. I think that's another thing that Sesame does so well, is helping. We've done parental addiction, parental incarceration, homelessness, foster care. Many of those issues, even mental health, people think are adult issues, and they don't stop to look at it through the lens of a young child. And that's what Sesame does so well, in a non-threatening, positive, hopeful way. And one other example I'll give you that I'm very proud of is about 8 years ago, when the Syrian crisis erupted. We realized that more children were displaced, refugees, and had to leave their home than any other time since World War II. And we had a lot of work in the Middle East. We had a local production in Jordan, a local production in Egypt. I had all this great content in Arabic. And so I thought, how can we help these children that left their schools behind, their homes behind, have no access to early education? And I went to the International Rescue Committee, a man named David Miliband, who runs that organization, because there are a lot of great organizations doing a lot of great work, but they had sort of the most of a footprint on the ground in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, working with refugees and their families. And I said, could we do a pilot and see if I gave you Arabic content, videos, storybooks, resources, could that help with your home visits, your learning centers? And so we did this pilot in Jordan. It was incredibly successful, and we ended up applying for the MacArthur Foundation's first ever $100 million grant for any organization addressing a pressing need of our time. And I said, well, we'll never win, but this is definitely a pressing need of our time. And we applied. 19 months later, 1,900 applicants later, we were given that first ever $100 million. And we created the largest early childhood intervention in the history of humanitarian response in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And what it meant was we created an entire new production called Ahlan Simsim, which means welcome in Arabic. Simsim means sesame, so it's welcome sesame. We created new Muppets. Yes, there's Elmo. Yes, there's Grover, but there was Bosma and Jod. And Jod was a little boy Muppet who had to leave his home. We don't call him the refugee Muppet, but you get that children could identify. Bosma, a little girl Muppet, becomes his best friend, welcomes Jod into her community, her home. And so that allows us storylines. Jod had to leave everything behind, his toys, his school, his home. We're reaching 29 million children with Ahlan Simsim on digital, satellite, radio. Then we created all of these materials so that the IRC had materials when they went in to do home visits for refugee families, when they created learning centers, even WhatsApp so that parents could access the content. And that's a great example of making sure that we're reaching children who otherwise wouldn't have access to early education through media. Again, it's like the 2020 version of 1969, right? Using this powerful tool to reach children. And it's been incredible. It's now moved to Bangladesh, Rohingya crisis. We now are doing work in Ukraine, in Latin America, where migrants are on the move. It's just been an incredible learning opportunity, and again, a way of using Sesame to address real issues and real needs of children who are in conflict or crisis.
How powerful for kids in these horrendous situations to know that there's somebody thinking about them and that cares about them, and they're not lost and forgotten. That's absolutely beautiful.
Well, there's also universal appeal. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think Joan often said when she created Sesame Street, she thought she was creating the quintessential American show. To your point, Alex, it was on a stoop in Harlem with a multiracial cast. Within a year, Germany, Mexico, and Brazil all wanted their own local productions. And that's what led to our Plaza Sesamo, Via Sesamo, Sesamstrasse. And, she realized the Muppets have this universal appeal. If you're Elmo, you can be in South Africa or Latin America or the Middle East. Children identify with you, right? You're a little monster Muppet. You don't look Asian or American. And I've been all over the world with Elmo. I've been in refugee camps. I've been, in the Middle East. I've been in Bangladesh. I've been in Africa. And children just go wild. I mean, there is something about these little furry monsters that is incredibly appealing, and it's really powerful. I'm sorry, Alex, yes. I interrupted you.
No, and hearing the story or the birth of Sesame Street through the civil rights movement, the poverty that was gripping our society and the levels of inequality, it makes me think to the origination story of me meeting Hugh and Gabriel and connecting to ask for their help and helping me in my journey be able to connect with young men. And the topic that brought us to the table is gender-based violence, a very difficult topic, but one that is ubiquitous now, in the U.S. There are 35 million survivors of sexual violence in the U.S., every year. There's 650,000 new victims of sexual violence. The reality is we all already know a victim, but they don't feel safe to speak up, and they're living in isolation and silence and shame. And it's only through connecting and talking that we can begin to even think about and address these things. And so many of the themes that you've talked about, we worked very hard to create a tagline that we could bring all members of the community around. And we spent quite a bit of time coming up with a simple statement of safety starts with respect. And when, Hugh mentioned the potential to have you come on this podcast, it immediately clicked in my head. This safety starts with respect. Like, I could almost track the genesis of that inherent feeling that my wife and I had in ourselves from, the goodness of Sesame Street, because we all need those examples and people speaking out, to be able to point to. And, this whole concept of teaching our young people, one major part of what we talk about at our org is prevention work, and not prevention work in terms of asking you to carry keys between your fingers or not walk down a dark street, but is more from a positive perspective of how can we teach our young people about respect, empathy.
That's very Sesame, right?
Yes.
That is, I get it. Our work around the world, and particularly in regions of conflict, we've done work with Albanians and Serbs in Kosovo, with Northern Ireland, with Protestants and Catholics, a number of different regions in conflict. Israel, Palestine is mutual respect and understanding. And I think mutual respect speaks exactly to your point.
Yes, and I know both my wife and our executive director, Katie Shipp, were actually dying to be on this podcast because, obviously we all grew up with Sesame Street, but Katie has 2 young kids, and she even speaks to them in an age-appropriate way about consent in terms of bodily autonomy. And if Uncle Billy wants to run in and give a hug, it's okay for a child to say no thank you, and just begin building those muscles and the muscle memory of understanding what consent is. And consent needs to have respect and kindness and understanding for it to all exist. So, this is interesting that I never thought I'd be doing this work, Sherrie. I was just a normal, fairly ignorant man who had to learn quite a bit. But it was a matter of, and with Hugh and Gabriel, we talk all the time about asking and challenging boys and young men to say, how can you connect to what you are in your core? And unfortunately, so many of us have built so many barriers internally that if we're asked a simple question like, please give me 3 words to describe who you are in your soul, in your core, like when you were brought into this world, it is interesting to see the difficulty sometimes people have navigating through the obstacles that they've created inside themselves. But when you get down to it, there are all of these messages that Sesame Street stands for, right? Caring, love, community, support. And I think our society all needs to watch Sesame Street more and again, and do it intergenerationally, because everything you're focusing on, and God bless you and thank you for doing it for 27 years, is to keep it coming, because we need it now more than ever. We need to hear these messages of honesty, of finding what binds us together, not what separates us. And with that sort of acknowledgement, how do you envision the next 50 years for Sesame Street?
Well, listen, it's a challenging time because of all of the issues that so many of us are dealing with, and particularly nonprofits from a funding standpoint. Sesame Workshop has always been a 501c3 nonprofit. We produce Sesame Street around the world, but we have to find the funding to do that. But I just think, to your point, the world needs Sesame more than ever, and therefore we'll figure it out. We have to. It's more important than ever. And we've had some hurdles in terms of our international work. You all know about USAID funding being cut. That affected Sesame in a big way in Iraq, Bangladesh, and India. So there are challenges, but I think that the values of Sesame Street, the sort of critical need to be focused on helping all children grow smarter, stronger, and kinder is what keeps us going and keeps us so determined. My job is to make sure Sesame's here for the next 55 years, long after I'm gone. And that's something that is a privilege, and I'm so determined to do. So, we do as much as we can to figure out new business models to support the work, new philanthropic funding. But I, couldn't be more committed to carrying on the work.
Well, thank you, for that. And gentlemen, do you have any last questions or comments for Sherrie? Because I know you have a very busy schedule, and we're so grateful for you making the time for us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, because it's really been fun.
Thank you for coming on. I think my only question would be, what is the overarching message that, Sesame is looking to leave viewers in the future? And I know Alex asked about, the next 50 years, but what do you see as, if you could describe in one phrase, the history of Sesame, as well as, what it's continuing to promote and what it will promote? What is that in one phrase?
I think it's that Sesame is about using the power of media, right? And today, don't think of that as television. It's every form. Wherever children are, that's where we'll be. Whatever platforms they're using, whatever digital media, we want to reach children where they are. And it's using that power to help children in their critical early years have the tools and the access to early education they need to thrive. So there is so much research. I truly believe we have the greatest impact on the world, not just kids, by reaching children in their critical early years. Because if that generation grows up smarter, stronger, and kinder, and we know that we can have more impact by reaching them in the early years, that's the greatest return on investment for society as a whole. How can kids have the skills they need to rebuild society if we're missing that critical early year window when they need to build those skills and have the foundation that supports everything they'll do after that? So it's really using the power of media to reach children, young children, in those first 5 years of life to help them grow smarter, stronger, and kinder, and put them on a path to thrive.
If there's one thing that you think children that are teenagers and even young kids can take away, like one important life skill for them to learn, what would you say that, like one emotion to focus on?
I would say it's empathy. I think it's empathy and respect for others is how you have to be able to deal with others. And those are, I think, really important social, emotional skills to have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sherrie. To our audience, please check out sesameworkshop.org. There are a number of great resources available, and we look forward to being with you on our next podcast. So, Sherrie, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sherrie.
Okay. Bye, guys. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.